Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Dollar Dialogue. Today, we're here with another very interesting guest speaker with another very interesting topic. Our topic of discussion today is episode 23, Australia's Coal Conundrum, National Interest versus Global Pressure. And today with us, we have Mr. Daniel Sun. He's a junior at the Knox Grammar School in Australia. He's a very talented person when it comes to Australian political economic affairs. He has been doing Model UN for some time now, so he knows a lot of things about politics. He knows a lot of things about economics. And as usual, we have myself, Arif Malik, and our two other hosts, Shazib Karim and Arif Malik. So Daniel Sun, would you like to add anything to the introduction that I just said?
You did it all, Arif. Took me away. So, in terms of this, I have been in Australia. I'm an Australian citizen, so naturally I would know a little bit about Australian politics. If I had anything, if you wanted my personal opinion on Australian politics, it's a massive mess. Nobody knows what they're doing. The politicians are idiots, and that's what we get.
Like that's politicians. Politics is a very interesting affairs, and politicians are. They have a lot of debates to go through, so it's kind of gets messy. And I think it's not just Australia. I think it's every single country around the world, unless you live in DPRK, where it's just one word and one action. That's my opinion. All right, so let's get into the topic of discussion, which is Australia's coal conundrum, national interest versus global pressure. So to start off, I would like to state some statistics and some basic information. So Australia is the fourth largest coal producer and second largest oil exporter in the world, behind Indonesia. And in 2022, Australia produced around 565 million tons of coal. And I believe that also in 2022, Australia exported approximately 370 million tons of coal, generating around $120 billion in revenue. And coal exports make up around 15% of total exports of Australia. And there are different types of coal that are used. And as a Bangladeshi, we have also, I believe, a lot of coal plants. And I know a little bit about these things as I studied in school when I was younger. And I think there are two main types of coal: thermal coal, which is used to produce electricity. And I think Australia exported about 200 million tons of thermal coal in 2022. And there's also metallurgical coal, which is used for steel production. And Australia exported approximately 170 million tons of metallurgical coal. And the export destinations of Australia is very diverse. Like major importers of Australian coal include India, China, Japan, and South Korea. But around 25% of Australian coal exports go to China. And coal also remains a dominant energy source for electricity generation in Australia, though its shares have been decreasing. In 2022, 56% of Australia's electricity was generated from coal-fired power plants, down from 80% a decade earlier. And for the future projections, coal share in electricity generation is projected to drop to around 15% by 2040 as renewable, like solar and wind, increase. And as for the energy transition, and the energy transition is a very key focus of our discussion today, because around the world, not just Australia, around the world, European countries, North American countries, then Asian, African, all the countries around the world, they want to shift towards a more renewable future. And that's why the Australian government is doing the same thing as well. They aim for a 43% emissions reduction by 2030 and net zero by 2050, signaling a shift away from coal reliance. As for the greenhouse gas emissions, which I believe is very much important, because as there's a lot of global warming going on around the world right now, Australia is also unfortunately one of the world's largest per capita emitters of CO2, driven largely by its reliance on coal. And in 2022, Australia's coal combustion contributed approximately 180 million tons of CO2 to its total 450 million tons of CO2 emissions. So this highlights that a lot of coal, like CO2 emissions that's coming from Australia or that's going out of Australia, is from coal. And coal power plants and coal-fired power plants are responsible for around 30% of Australia's total carbon emissions, which is a very high number. And as for air pollution, coal, when you burn coal, there are a lot of gases that are formed, and this contributes to air pollution, including particles of PM 2.5 and sulfur dioxide, SO2. And this obviously is bad for the environment. This is obviously bad not just for the environment, for people as well who are working on these plants and who live near these plants. And this has led to health impacts, particularly in mining regions. And despite international pressure and domestic calls for stronger climate action, Australia continues to export large quantities of coal, contributing to global emissions. And as for the contribution to GDP, Coal mining accounts for around 1.4% of Australia's GDP and directly employs about 50,000 people, which is a large number, with many people more indirectly involved in related industries. And as for the regional economics, because you have to first understand Australia is a very large country when it comes to area, not when it comes to people, but it's a very large country. It's a continent itself, so it's very large. And so coal mining is a key driver in regional economics, particularly in Queensland and New South Wales, as I'm aware of when I went to Australia and visited some coal power plants. Not visited them, but I took a tour guide of them, where the majority of coal production is concentrated. And in 2021, coal mining contributed nearly 5.5 billion Australian dollars in royalties to the state of Queensland alone. And as for the mine closure, there's also a little bit decline in coal industry. The transition away from coal has led to the plant closure of several coal plants and coal fire stations, such as the Airing power station, I might be pronouncing it wrong, which is the Australia's largest coal fire plant, which is scheduled to close by 2025. And major financial institutions and other major financial institutions in Australia are divesting away from coal, recognizing the long-term risk associated with the sector. And this is evident as over 1 trillion Australian dollars in Australian investments have pledged to shift away from fossil fuels such as coal. And in 2022, renewable energy contributed to over 35% of Australia's electricity mix, and surpassing coal-fired power stations for the first time. This trend towards renewable is accelerating with large-scale projects and household adoption of rooftop solar panels. So this is a very brief introduction about the Australian coal industry. And so are there any more information or any more opinions that you would like to share to the things that I've just said? Daniel Son, Arif Malik, or Shazib Karim?
In terms of the Australian problem, there are mainly three stakeholders, right? Three key factors in this. I'd say, three key factors. First of all, we are talking about the Australian government. Like, what does the government want? What does they want in terms of tax revenue? What do they want in terms of like political power? What do they want in terms of governing the country, right? Second major stakeholder would obviously be like the general public, right? The general public would be split into like two subsectors, I'd say, which is going to be the second and the third stakeholders. The public is split into two: the people who want lower taxation, cheaper energy and jobs, and the more environmentally oriented people who want to save the environment, that sort of thing, right? So Australia, obviously, the reason there's a lot of international pressure, for example, like we have like the G20 summit in like 2021, 2022, 2023, right? Happens year after year. Australia is under a lot of pressure to halve its emissions, or like to reduce its emissions to zero by 2025 to fit in with many United Nations goals. However, there's main things regarding this, right? Australia does not use nuclear energy. Australia is one of the few countries in the world where nuclear energy is completely banned, mostly due to fear-mongering by certain political parties, and a general lack of consensus in the Australian public. The Australian public has historically had I would say, almost a unsubstantiated fear of anything to do with nuclear. Not just nuclear energy, nuclear weapons, etc., but virtually anything to do with nuclear. In fact, in Australia, we have literally one nuclear reactor located in Sydney, which exists for research and also to produce like radioisotopes for medicine, for example, like chemotherapy, right? That's the main problem in Australia. So what do we rely on? Australia is very dry. Arif has been down here. I'd expect him to agree with me. It's very, very hot in the summer. Apart from the coastal cities, we don't really have many like large rivers. In fact, climate change is slowly getting bad to the point where rivers such as like the Murray-Darling are already essentially drying up at this point. There are no like major rivers which can be tapped to use for like hydro energy. There's quite a few hydroelectric plants, but mainly these are smaller. We don't have any big hydroelectric plants such as the Three Gorges Dam. That's the first problem. So no alternative sources of energy. The only real alternative that Australia does have is solar panels. We do have wind turbines, but wind is generally not too strong in Australia, and plus it's more inconsistent. Australia, however, does get a lot of sun, so that's why solar is a more consistent source of energy per se. So what do we have? We have abundance of natural resources, infinite amounts of land, and lots of coal. So Australia obviously naturally will turn to coal, right? This has produced an industry that supports a majority of the Australian population. It provides 1.4% of GDP, as Araf has said, and it is it gets the government a lot of tax because, these companies are heavily taxed under environmental schemes. And of course, the government would be interested in the tax revenue coming from the coal industry. So that's the government's perspective. They want Australia to have coal as its main source of new renewable energy. They want Australia to continue its trade relationships with China, etc. And they want the tax revenue from the coal industry. And essentially, to put it bluntly, Australia government does not want to piss off the people, because if they shut down coal, power, prices would skyrocket. People would, like, a bunch of people, as I said, like, over 100,000 people in Australia would lose jobs. And for a population of only 25 million, to give context, it's like the whole of Shanghai, the population of Shanghai, but like in a country like 2/3 the size of China. That is what we're talking about. Extremely spread out, mostly concentrated along the coast. So because of that, right, if just even like, let's just say 100,000 people of the population lose their jobs, that is still a significant amount of the population. You will have rights. The government is going to get like voted out the next year. This the second a new, like we vote every 4 years, right? So for example, we're voting at the end of this year. The second voting season rolls around, this government is going to get voted out. Australia is a representative democracy. Whoever suggested the stupid idea of, let's get rid of coal is instantly going to get voted out. So the government isn't like dumb enough to do that. But now, in terms of like the stakeholder of the international community, that's where obviously, people want Australia to stop, producing that much greenhouse emissions. It's understandable because coal is a major producer of greenhouse emissions. I'm sure anybody who knows basic chemistry in high school will understand this. Any combustion reaction, the fuel and oxygen will combine to create, what is it, CO2 gas, carbon dioxide gas, and water vapor, H2O. Because of that reaction, anything that involves combustion to generate heat, such as burning anything, especially coal, is going to create large amounts of not only toxic smoke, soot, and all the other nasty trace chemicals, but you will get infinite amounts of CO2, right? Carbon dioxide is a nasty chemical. It floats up, stays in the atmosphere, and heats up, because the sun rays, when like solar radiation is reflected onto Earth to heat up the Earth, right? It cannot go back out because the molecules of carbon dioxide block it. That's why it's called a greenhouse gas. It turns the Earth into a greenhouse, or I would more accurately put it as an oven. It will bake you to death. So the international community doesn't want that. Also, in particular, I would say this as a more minor issue. You would have, obviously, Australia is providing a lot of its its metal ore and its iron ore, especially, as well as its coal supplies to China. Now, there's obviously internal debate in Australia regarding whether that's good, because Australia, even though it's China's biggest trade partner and vice versa, they're not on the best terms politically, especially with US backing. Australia needs to toe a line between good trade relationship with China and not like annoying its Western allies. So there's that perspective. And finally, in terms of the people, right now, what do the people think? Obviously, in Australia, people want, as I'm sure with any other country, we want cheaper housing prices, cheaper electricity prices, cheaper fuel prices, and just essentially live lower tax, right? Because we already have a period of inflation. Everything is already like insanely expensive, and plus we have housing crisis, we have electricity crisis, blah blah blah, job crisis. It's bad enough here in Australia as is, and so coal is one of the things that people don't want to get rid of. But as the newer generation is rolling around, we are talking about, the Gen Z, and I'd argue especially Gen Alpha as they get older, and some millennials as well, if you would consider that. When the newer generation rolls around, these people are going to be more environmentally conscious. They are going to be, in political slang, a bit more woke. They're going to be a bit more progressive, less, conservative, caring less about property and, living conditions, but more for, like how the environment goes. They're likely also to be a little bit more fanatical about this issue. So we will likely see coal, use go steadily down, as Araf has said, in that trend. But the only way really for Australia to solve the issue, in my opinion, is to instate nuclear energy, because there's nothing else to bridge the gap. Like, Australia in already, right? It's free mostly for people. It's very, very cheap, almost free, and free and like completely free in some areas for people to put solar panels on their roof. Like me personally, my house, we have about a few 20 something solar panels on top of the roof, right? That collects electricity. We can use that during the day. You can also sell it to the government through the grid, and you get like a rebate. So if we make X amount of electricity, we give that to the government for free, and therefore we don't have to pay for X amount of electricity, even though it's a bit finicky, but that's roughly how it works. The problem with solar is that coal works 24 hours all the times of the day. Most people don't have space to put a battery. Also, batteries are known for exploding because most of them contain lithium, right? So and Australia is a hot country, so putting a battery outside is often impractical. It's too expensive. Again, anything that's expensive, people don't want it, right? Because the government's not about to subsidize batteries. And batteries also use lithium. That's a whole other environmental issue we won't talk about. But because batteries are a massive problem, right? Solar can't give you power at night. Solar also can't give you power when there's clouds and there's just no sun out, right? So there needs to be a sustainable form of energy. The best, like that is continuous. The best way, in my personal opinion, would to obviously have solar as the main source of energy, but then have the nuclear reactors run as well, because nuclear reactors will always be there regardless of the weather 24 hours a day. And with modern nuclear reactors, they are infinitely safer than the ones we had before. Chernobyl will likely not happen again because that reactor, the way it was constructed, was the design itself was flawed from the very conception. It used a liquefied metal, like an alloy of sodium and potassium. Now, if you know anything about those two metals, they explode on contact with water. AKA, the Soviets, that whole reactor was based on having a water cooling ring, and the inner core was cooled using a molten explosive metal. Obviously, that's going to go wrong. So it was flawed. It was a flawed design. Modern reactors don't use that. We just use pure, superheated water. And that sort of problem does not really exist as much in the modern day. So that's my rundown overall in terms of what I believe the landscape is like, how, we have the Australian government's interest, the people's interest, and international interest, and my personal opinion on how to get rid of it, which is, nuclear energy. Now, is there anything else we would like to add?
Yeah, I had a question for you, if you don't mind, but even Ari Bar, if you guys can also chime in if you want. So my question to you is, with Australia having such vast potential for renewable energy, particularly solar and wind, what are the barriers preventing a faster transition to greener energy sources?
Yes. Okay. As I have stated, one of the barriers is going to be cost, because when we get rid of coal energy, which is rather cheap for, sustainable energy sources, which at the moment with modern technology, we still can't produce them en masse for cheap, that is going to be a cost barrier. That is the first reason. It's simply too expensive. The government doesn't want to pay for it, and the people even more don't want to pay for it. And if the government is going to force the people to pay for it, then because it's a democracy, the people are just going to elect that government out. That's the first problem. Second problem is, again, I have said this, solar energy doesn't always work. Renewables don't always work. They depend heavily on weather conditions. Whereas something like, coal-fired power plant, right? We can just burn the coal inside all day long, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, right? That sort of thing never happens. It doesn't with solar or wind, right? If it rains, if it gets cloudy, boom, you don't have electricity. You have to go back to the Stone Age with candles and stuff. But with solar, with coal and nuclear, you always have a steady supply of electricity on hand. And unfortunately, batteries are simply not a sustainable option because they use a lot of lithium. They're also explosive. And in Australia, where there's a hot sun and we get bushfires every single other month, it seems like, that's a generally bad idea. The other issue regarding sustainable or renewables is that Australia is very big. Very, very big. Australia is about roughly the size of India, if you could times that landmass by about 2.5. It's 2.5 times as big as India in terms of landmass, with a minor fraction of India's population. If you compared Australia's population to India's population, if I'm not wrong, it's something along the lines of 2%, right? Within that big of an area, even though most people are concentrated at the outskirts, Australia does have quite a large rural population. We have a lot of people in the country, right? With nuclear energy, you can just, or with coal, you can have a power plant in the main cities around the people because their power plants are generally smaller. You put a power plant down and you can wire it with a few kilometers of cable to your nearest town or city. Now, if we have solar energy, wind energy, or even hydro energy, you need a lot more space to put it, which Australia isn't a problem with. But the problem is when you need a lot larger area to, install the facility in. You need to, think about it. If you need good electricity production with solar panels, you need to cover half a desert, a couple hundred square kilometers with them to be able to produce enough that one or two, nuclear or coal plants could produce. Same thing with wind turbines. You need to have an entire wind farm, and that would sometimes not work all the way because there's less wind. And, with, hydro, we don't really have that big of a dam. Because of that issue, if you would build one of these facilities, you'd have to run hundreds, if not thousands of kilometers worth of electricity cables from one end of Australia, literally from the middle of Australia to one of the coastal cities where people actually live in. That is infeasible. That is ridiculously expensive and likely prone to issues. Australia's government is known for just really not being good at building. I say this from personal experience. There's a house across the road from me, public institution that's been built. That's been going on for 4 years now. Still not done, not even halfway done. Australia does not have a good work ethic, especially with government like employees in general. There's a massive issue, I'd say, regarding, things not being done up to budget or like, up to like par or up to speed. So if we already had the NBN, the Australia's like national broadband network, that failed miserably. There's a reason why it's called shitBN sometimes as a joke. It's really, really bad. So if you're calling on the government to lay hundreds of kilometers worth of cables, how do you think that's going to turn out? It's not going to work.
Yeah, I would agree with Daniel, and like Shazid, to also answer your question, like you have to think about the political consequences as well. Like I think Daniel was talking about this as well. So like in Australia, the coal is predominantly a significant contributor of the Australian economy, and it's basically Australia's like largest or second largest export, and it generates more than like 50 billion Australian dollars in export revenue. So like there's a dependency on coal, and which is very pronounced in states like Queensland and like New South Wales, where there's a large community and like regional economy that rely heavily on coal mining for employment and for like infrastructure development. And because of this, such economic entrenchment makes abrupt transitions challenging, like as you were saying about like transitioning to renewable sources of energy. So I would like to add like a personal touch to it as well. So like when me and Araf went to Australia in it was like around 2019, and we saw that, and we actually like visited we visited like a couple of the coal infrastructures, where basically it was a tour, and we saw like how much dependent the Australian economy is, and there are like millions of workers who depend on coal infrastructure. And like we were also like we were like surprised to see that majority of it is going to like China and other countries in Asia. And like because of this, there's a huge dependency on coal. So because of this, I feel like it would be very volatile to change the energy sector to renewable energy sector. And also because there's a political aspect to it as well, because like if you change the energy policies to more renewable energy, there will be like significant inertia, because the people will definitely won't like it, and there will be like backlash and immediate effects of those as well. And also I would also say that moving too quickly to renewable energy would also lead to some economic disallocation, unemployment, and like social unrest in regions which are particularly dependent on coal. And therefore I don't know if there's like a carbon tax on coal mining on Australia, or if
there definitely is, especially for areas that are like protected areas like national parks. Occasionally, like if the government will allow lobbying companies to lobby to build a coal mining facility or like a mine within like a protected area, even though there's like native species there, whatever, because it's of like important economic gain. The other issue in Australia is like often these areas that have coal are like areas where indigenous Australians, Aboriginal people, they also reside there, and that causes like extreme amounts of political fallout, because the government has to decide between like whether like massive economic benefit or like being potentially called racist.
Yeah, I would agree. Like carbon tax would definitely, or like coal tax would definitely be helpful. But like in Australia, it's not really effective. Or like, what do you think is what do you think is like the main barrier? Like usually in the US, like in California, for example, like there's a huge carbon tax on companies to decrease the pollution, and it actually works. But for Australia, it's not really working. So what do you think some of the factors are?
In terms of tax, well, as obviously with the US, right, like no citizens of any country really like tax, but Australia's coal mining industry is a behemoth in itself, because often, right, we're talking the people in parliament, because Australia is a representative democracy. America is slightly different. America is like the states are mostly free to do whatever the hell they kind of want to do, and then the main boss of America is either Trump, Biden, or whatever. It's almost similar to an autocracy. I wouldn't say America is like 100% like a true democracy in that sense, right? The problem with that is Australia politicians depend heavily on lobbyists. They depend on lobbyists, like these big coal companies, to fund them, because they often don't have the political capital otherwise, right? They can't convince the population. They don't have enough money to like fund their campaign and stuff. So they're desperate to please, they have to make the big coal companies, whatever, big fossil fuel companies happy. If they don't make him happy, they just won't give them funds. The party won't do well, and obviously every single party wants to do well because that's a literal point. They're fighting tooth and nail for position in the Senate or the House of Representatives, or even like for sure a prime minister, like the top two, like Liberal or Labour. They're always struggling over it. And since coal is so important to Australia, it's so integral, and there's a massive, massive industry surrounding coal, because that industry is so big, it has a massive political power, it has extreme lobbying power. And thus, you could almost expect the thing to occur as it is occurring today. If you try to put a tax on coal, that any government stupid enough to put a tax on coal will have its support rapidly withdrawn from the lobbying companies. The other thing is that the people will hate you. Like, sure, we're talking in America, in California, right? What is California's demographic mainly? College students. We need to be friendly to the environment, the environmentally more eco-friendly, students, the people who are young, they don't really understand how the world works. They have this idealistic perspective of the world, we got to save the environment. Oh yeah, whatever. So they're more likely to go along with whatever the government does. Problem within Australia, because the coal is such an integral industry, and also because that Australians probably dislike tax a little bit more, and also when you interfere with the on Australia, there's a thing where the people really, really don't like government interference, even when it's probably beneficial towards them. So there's that. Also, if the government would look extremely bad if they suddenly decided, we're going to raise the tax on coal. Therefore, every one of you is going to suffer heavily, right? All of you guys, because all your electricity comes from coal. Automatically, every single one of you is going to start paying twice as much for electricity, right? We're going to get X amount of people. These people, you're all jobless now. Congratulations, try to be homeless, because Australia already has a massive housing crisis. How do you think that's going to go? There's physically no way any government is stupid enough in a way to pull that off, because that's how you gain the instant anger from the whole civilian populace. Nobody will support you. And that's why a coal tax is never effective in Australia, because the people, to phrase it simply, right? Who cares if you're going to suffocate tomorrow from CO2 if you're starving today? Right? The people aren't as focused about the environment or the next generation when they're scared that, suddenly fueling, getting a full car tank worth of petrol is going to be $200 and, my husband's going to go homeless now because we're going to have to go homeless because my husband, the person who works in a coal mine, now suddenly loses his job, or that sort of thing, right? The carbon tax is never going to work in Australia until Australia relies heavily on another form of electricity other than coal. Because if you get rid of coal, you put a massive tax on it, you're taxing 20% of every single Australian's income. That is not going to go down well. And that's the main reason why it's probably never going to work.
Yeah, that makes much sense.
I think, and also to add on, I'd say in my opinion, although the costs of wind and solar have dropped significantly, the upfront capital costs for building renewable energy projects, grid upgrades, and storage systems are still high. And this is particularly challenging in a market where coal plants are already in place and considered sunk costs. And competing with established energy sources can delay investments in renewables. And without strong incentives, it may be financially difficult for renewable energy projects to outcompete coal and gas in the short term. And I think there also might be some social and cultural factors as well, because there's a cultural attachment to coal in certain regions of Australia, where coal mining has been the backbone of the local economy for generations. And there's also skepticism about renewable energy in these areas, partly due to the fear of job losses and economic decline. And this cultural resistance can slow down efforts to transition into renewables, and as governments need to balance these concerns with national and global environmental goals.
Thank you, Daniel, Shazib Karim, and Arif Malik for sharing all the opinions. I believe, it's true that Australia has to think about its stakeholders. Again, Australia is a democratic country. They can't just implement a policy, because the politicians also have to worry about their vote bank. They have to worry about whether this policy is going to be popular among the people, because that's how democracy works. You have to make sure you're keeping people happy. And Daniel, I liked your stakeholder analysis very much, and I believe that it has a lot of through the stakeholder analysis, we see how Australia's coal industry might shape in the future, because you have the international industry, international, like the different world agreements, different world organizations who want Australia to shift away from coal. Then you have the Australian politicians, then you have the Australian people who might not want to do that, because when you shift away from coal is very cheap. Yeah, it's environmentally not friendly, but it's very cheap, and many people might not want to shift away from it, even though it's environmentally not friendly. Because again, at the end of the day, people want to make sure that they're able to have a better life, and one of the ways you can have a better life is having more money. And if you shift away from coal, you're increasing the expenses of living for people, and that's probably a shift away from having a better life, because coal is cheap. And if you replace with other industries such as solar or those things, they're very expensive. And Australia, again, Daniel, thank you for mentioning that. We also, I think, discussed that in our Model Union conference in Harvard and Boston about the use of nuclear energy. And a lot of people think that nuclear energy is unsafe, nuclear energy is this, that. But again, through our conference, we're able to see that nuclear energy, if taken certain steps, it's very safe. And as for the global demand of coal, is again expected to peak in the mid 2020s, driven by energy transition in China, India, and other major coal importers. This decline will directly impact Australia's coal export markets. After a diplomatic rift in 2023, I think China imposed an unofficial ban on Australia's coal imports, leading to a temporary decline in exports. However, by 2023, some coal trade with China resumed, which again highlights that Australia and China, even though they might have diplomatic differences and even ideological difference in terms of ruling, in terms of governing their citizens, this coal, this mineral or raw material, whatever you want to call it, this is the ones that linking them together. And despite global demand falling, India's coal imports from Australia have remained strong, with India expected to be a key market in the near term. Again, India has 1 billion people, more than 1 billion people, so they need a lot of coal to provide their citizens with electricity. And also, while Australia is transitioning away from coal for domestic energy, several new coal mining projects are in development, primarily for export markets. These projects face opposition from environmental groups and local communities, as Daniel has highlighted. And the rapid decline in global demand, coal demand, and the transition to cleaner energy resources increases the risk of stranded coal assets in Australia, potentially leaving billion in coal reserves untapped. And again, our topic of discussion today is episode 23, Australia's coal conundrum, national interest versus global pressure. And you have to also think of, as some of you have already highlighted, about Australia's national interest. In terms of national interest, they export a lot of coal, around 200 million tons in 2022, and they have also a lot of political lobbying, as Daniel has mentioned. The coal industry has a very powerful political lobbying pressure, pushing for policies that maintain the coal's central role in the economy. But there are a lot of global pressure that's arising, and the first one is the international climate agreements. The Paris Agreement, I believe, is which Australia is a signatory of, commits to keep global warming well below 2% and aiming for net zero emissions by 2050. And Australia has a target to reduce global emissions, carbon emissions, by 43% in 2030 from 2005 levels. And as part of international climate efforts, there's a growing pressure from organizations like the United Nations and OECD for countries, especially developed ones, to phase out coal production and transition to renewable energy. And also, while Australia's domestic coal use has declined, it remains one of the world's largest coal exporters, with around 270 million tons of coal exports. And Australia's per capita emissions are also, again, largely driven by coal-fired power plants. And in Australia, and I think this is a very important statistic, that 56% of all Australia's electricity was generated from coal, contributing heavily to its 450 million tons of CO2 emissions. So my question for Daniel is that, how do you, again, in my opinion, in my personal opinion, I think that Australia is even though it's not a superpower like the US or China, it's a regional, or even you can say global hegemon. So they have a lot of influence in the global economy. They have a lot of influence in global policies. So how do you think Australian government is going to manage this international struggle for green and renewable energy transition? Because the Australian government, again, I believe it's committed to making sure coal is a central part of the economy, because it keeps prices cheaper. But again, they plan to also phase it out. But how do you think the government is going to manage with the international pressure that Australia must shift away from coal and to green renewable energy transitions, Daniel?
As the way any government works in the world is that obviously sort of political goals and whatever has to essentially come first. Doesn't matter how pressed they are about energy transition. Australia obviously cannot just go out and say, oh, we don't care at all about the renewable energy transition. They still have to do G20, whatever. It looks good. Otherwise, it's for the sake of essentially looking good for the propaganda. They have to look good. You can't just, no country in the world is willing to just go, oh, I don't care about renewable energy. You know, the people tomorrow can like starve and drown and, you know, die in all this pollution. We don't really give a damn. They don't want to. But every single country kind of thinks like that, because at the end of the day, everybody wants like their economies to flourish with like cheap energy and lower taxes. That sort of thing kind of needs to happen. The way the Australian government is going to manage this, well, let's like first of all think about how the Australian government is going to need to go about managing it. What does the Australian government need, right? What is it? So therefore, if you know what it needs, you know kind of roughly what it's going to do. Now, first of all, the Australian government can't just ditch coal because the people, and also if the Australian government ditches coal, the international pressure is arguably going to get like even worse for like a different reason. China, 25%, India, like 15% of the coal, right? If you just suddenly get rid of coal, all of these like, you know, massive industrial powers at the moment who are pumping out all of the things, who have massive populations, highest in the world, and who have like, they rely on this coal. You get rid of coal, they are not going to react kindly. Like China, while it imposed like a tariff on Australian coal, still allowed most of it through, and the tariff wasn't exactly like spectacular. It was more like a move of political protest, much like the wine tariff thing, rather than any sort of actual. It was more like sort of political punishment and just to rile people up than to actually like, you know, prohibit Australian coal. Because of Australia, because China cannot really go that far without like Australian coal. Well, it's not going to like go that far willingly. It could, but it's not willing because the price would be too expensive, and you know, it's in this industrial capability would have to be toned down a little bit. So if Australia got rid of the coal, expect China, India, and a few other countries to be really, really diplomatically annoyed about that. And the diplomatic fallout, per se, you know, so to speak, is going to be rather bad. You are going to generate a shitstorm of countries pissed off that now you've taken away the most, you know, like the most efficient power resource. And they're going to have to seek other, you know, countries to get that resource because they do need it, right? So Australia is not about to risk that market, but Australia also can't just sit around, do nothing, and just continue with the status quo. There's domestic pressure. There's also pressure from other countries who want to look environmentally conscious. At the end of the day, environmental consciousness, or, you know, being pro-green, pro-environment comes down to like three key factors, right? First of all, what is your like domestic public's opinion? Secondly, what is like, you know, what looks good on the international stage? And finally, look, what countries are actually affected by climate change the most, right? Australia has become affected quite a bit, actually, surprisingly. For all of the developed countries, Australia has been affected a little bit more than most. We have bushfires like every few years that ravage the countryside. We have mouse plagues every decade, which think of like a flood, but then there's no water. Replace the water with mice. I am not kidding. Like you're wading about knee height roughly in mice, that sort of thing. Australia's been hit pretty hard by climate change. And so obviously the populace is going to have a natural understanding of like, oh, you know, fear of climate change, right? So there's going to be an acceleration. What I think the Australian government is going to do is maintain its status quo trading agreements with China, but also impose arguably more of a coal tax and fossil fuel tax. Australia is also going to arguably be transitioning more to, like, I'd say electric vehicles soon. I've been seeing quite a lot of Teslas around, and that's a pretty good indication of a trend lately. As a lot more of the population will probably be moving towards electrical vehicles as they slowly ramp up, like, the fuel tax. They're doing it slowly because if they shipped it suddenly by, like, you know, more than a few cents every single, like, you know, like 6 months or a year, right? The people are going to realize and they're going to be angry. But the Australian government is probably going to slowly just dial it up slightly, and eventually people just subconsciously use arguably less fossil fuels. Electricity, I genuinely do believe the Australian government will have to go nuclear sometime. It's not a matter of like if, it's a matter of when. It's physically impossible. They're genuinely considering it. No political party is just going to deny that, because with the change that is required to slow down the absolute ridiculous amount of bushfires and whatever, right, to make an actual dent, Australia is going to have to make some like pretty expensive cuts that are going to wreck the fuel price, like wreck the prices of electricity. And if the government doesn't have nuclear or something on standby, the people won't just let it happen. They'll right before it goes to that point. So I'm pretty sure you've seen like the protests when coal workers got sacked and whatever. The way the Australian government, I feel like, is going to go about this is definitely we'll have to do nuclear energy. Possibly we'll slowly raise it and, you know, raise awareness, public campaigns, whatever, to like support, you know, Teslas, you know, to subsidize like electrical vehicles, that sort of thing, and slowly increase fossil fuel tax. The other thing I believe Australia will do is probably shut down a few of its legacy coal sites. Australia has a lot of coal mines at the moment. A lot of them are running, but even though it's going to end up with people sacked, Australia is slowly closing down, controlling the media. When the media is not paying too much attention, Australia will tend to slowly and quietly, decrease the number of people employed every single year and closing some of the legacy mines. And Australia is likely to continue developing and keeping a few new mines. There's a likely possibility that the Australian government will permit fracking, even though there's significant opposition from environmental groups at the moment. But with the current economic climate, most Australians are, pro-cheap rather than pro-environment. So I think Australia will end up allowing fracking, but we don't exactly know how that goes. Nobody can predict that at the moment. What will definitely happen is that the Australian government is still going to be starting up a few new coal mines every single year. Some proposals, a lot less, but there will be large-scale proposals. Every single one that does get approved will have to be massive, high-yield, large-scale types of proposals, because we do need export to China and etc. That sort of thing needs to happen as long as China's willing to take the coal, because otherwise Australia's GDP and economy is going to start, going down. The people won't be too happy about that. That's how Australia's going to do it. Australia's going to play it slowly. Keep the thing with China as the status quo, slowly increase the tax, whatever, increase electrical vehicles, and Australia is going to have some sort of standby, whether it be nuclear, whether it be geothermal, whether it be, wave energy. Nobody quite knows. Australia does, at the end of the day, have to have something on standby, though. They can't just say, sad life, electricity is going to become more expensive. The public aren't going to take it. They have to have something in the back pocket to pull out and whip out and say, with this, we can still have less coal, but make power about the same, maybe slightly more expensive, but not too much. That's the way I'm going to go. I think Australia will go about it. Australia is never going to brute force the transition. It cannot afford to, and I don't think it's even physically possible. So Australia's going to have to take it slow.
Yeah, and I think to add my personal opinion and to answer your question, Araf, I'd say, in my opinion, Australia is signatory to international agreements like the Paris Agreement, committing to reducing its carbon emissions. But however, as a major coal exporter, the country faces criticism for its perceived lag in transitioning to renewables. And the international community, particularly environmental groups and trading partners, is pushing for stronger climate action. And the Australian government will need to balance its diplomatic relationships while showing that it is taking concrete steps towards renewable energy adoption. And this could involve setting more ambitious climate targets or developing clear transition plans by demonstrating a commitment to sustainability. And Australia could ease its international pressure and maintain its reputation as a responsible global leader. And also, key partners like the European Union and the United States have placed climate change high on their diplomatic agenda, and Australia may find itself negotiating trade deals or other international agreements where climate policy is a central concern. And for Australia to maintain strong diplomatic ties and trade relations, it will need to align with the global shift towards cleaner energy.
Yeah, I would agree with Shazib and Daniel, and I would also like to add that the Australian export sector is also not very diverse. Like I was researching about it, and I saw majority of the export sector is composed of mining, particularly coal exports, and while there is some share of agricultural sector that Australia exports, like meat and wheat, which are the main agricultural exports, they're not the composition of the export sector is pretty much coal. So I would say like in one of the earlier episodes we're talking about Middle Eastern countries such as Qatar or other countries such as the United Arab Emirates, and majority, and we're comparing them, and we saw Qatar, majority of its export sector is oil, but UAE is there's other sectors which are also contributing to the economy, like tourism and such. So I would say Australia is a very big country. It's obviously one sector, one sector composing majority of the export is not a very economically wise decision, in my opinion. So I would say Australia also needs to consider diversifying its export sector to not only coal, but also other stuff that Australia has comparative advantage in compared to other nations. And also also there's been significant divestment from coal, but I would say this divestment is not really effective, because if you see Australia has a legislative target which is to reach the net zero emissions by 2050 and like reduce the emissions by 43% by 2030. But like there's no fixed agenda like the Australian government is promoting, like Daniel was saying, and like so therefore it is very it's not very like it's not very reassuring to the people, like will there actually be such a divestment from coal, and will there actually be a net zero emission by 2050. And also like in 2016 I believe like Glencore announced that one of the Thamore culinary would be closed by 2019, and like so it shows that there has been some divestments from coal, but like at the end of the day it's not very much. And like environmentally speaking, this coal mining is definitely bad for the environment. So it causes a lot of like pollution. It also causes like soil erosion, and I would say therefore Australia needs to do something before it is too late. And I would say at this moment in time, like it's not very reassuring that the Australian government is doing anything effective. So there needs to be more. More of those coal taxes or carbon taxes. But yeah, like that, like as Daniel was saying, like the coal and the economy are like very interrelated. So if you like basically if you consider not if you like put too much pressure on coal, then your party won't win. So at the end of the day, it's just politics, and there's no like simple answer to how Australia will reduce its coal emissions and carbon emissions and such.
Thank you, Daniel, Son, Arif Malik, and Shazib Karim for all the opinions that have been shared. And I believe that, as Daniel has highlighted, Australia is also going towards a shift towards renewables. Renewables, including solar and wind energy, accounted for 35% of Australia's electricity generation in 2022. And it was the first year, I believe, which it surpassed coal power plants for the first time. And several coal power stations also are slated for closure, as Daniel has highlighted when the media is on looking. And many other power plants are also expected to close silently by 2035. And by 2040, Australia's coal share in electricity generation is also projected to fall to around 15% as renewables continue to shift. And also, I think there's also a lot of energy policies in presence. For example, the Australian government has committed to around 1.2 billion Australian dollars to support the development of a clean hydrogen industry as part of the energy transition. And also there's I think also a carbon capture and storage CCS project going on in Australia. Despite its economic reliance on coal, Australia is exploring CCS technology to reduce emissions from coal-fired power plants. Though the coal-fired power plants, technology is costly and not yet proven at scale. And also, I believe it is again Australia is a democratic country, so I think it's important to look at the public opinion. Survey shows that a majority of Australians support a stronger climate policy and the transition to renewable energy, with over 70% arguing that the government should reduce coal dependence. Again, but the survey has a lot of bias because it was taken mostly from the younger generation, Gen Z, as you can tell. And however, regional areas that rely on coal for jobs and economic growth often resist aggressive climate policies. This creates a tension between urban and regional populations. And also the government in Australia, for example, the Labour Party, which I think is the Liberal Party of Australia, not the Liberal, but I think it's more towards the left. While the Australian Labour Party has committed to more ambitious climate targets, it faces internal tensions and opposition from coal-dependent states, and also the conservative opposition, which is called the Liberal National Coalition, if I'm not wrong, which has historically supported the coal industry, criticizes aggressively climate policies for their potential impact on jobs and economic stability, especially in mining region. And also, there's also different other foreign factors that play a role here. For example, the International Energy Agency (IEA) projects that global coal demand will peak by the mid 2020s, driven by a shift towards renewable, particularly in China and India, which are Australia's largest coal buyers. And by 2040, global coal demand is expected to drop by 30-40%, putting Australia's coal exports market at risk of shrinking. And also, as global demand declines and climate regulations tighten, Australia risks having billions of dollars of coal reserves that cannot be economically mined or sold. And despite this, several new mines are also in development in Australia aimed at capturing short-term demands from countries like India and Southeast Asia. These projects face increasing financial and environmental scrutiny, but they're obviously funded heavily because a lot of rich stakeholders, by rich stakeholders I mean a lot of businessmen in the coal industry, have a lot to profit from it. And There's also a lot of transition strategies placed. For example, the Australian government has a pledge to support for coal-dependent regions through retraining programs and investments in key industries like renewables and hydrogen production. And diversifying regional economics away from coal dependence is seen as crucial for ensuring long-term economic stability in mining regions. And Australia also is exploring ways to contribute to global decarbonization, including renewable energy exports such as green hydrogen and carbon offset projects. And the government is looking to become a leading exporter of renewable energy by building large-scale solar and projects alongside unexportable hydrogen industry. So my question to Daniel and Aripa and Shazib, can chime in also. Do you think that the hydrogen industry has a future in a future in reducing Australians' dependence on coal?
Possibly. The only problem with hydrogen is the way hydrogen produced is commercially by the electrolyzation of water. That has to happen. Water, where the certain conductive salt is added and the electric current is passed through, the hydrogen collected, separated from the oxygen gas. That is the way hydrogen produced. Now, where are we getting the electricity from? Australia already doesn't have any issues, already has issues with electricity. The electricity comes from coal. So sure, we might be burning, less gasoline, but because we're using the coal, we're burning more coal to provide the electricity to make the hydrogen, and using that hydrogen, driving that hydrogen in a refrigerated, truck to a filling station and then pumping that into a car. All you're doing at the end of the day, possibly even more fossil fuels are being used because you are just still burning equal, if not slightly more fossil fuels, just complicating the process by 5-6 more steps. I don't think hydrogen really has a position in Australia unless the electricity problem is solved. And considering the fact that hydrogen is still a form of combustion engine, ethanol combustion engines would arguably have a better chance than hydrogen combustion engines, because again, any sort of combustion reaction at the end of the day has to produce some form of heat and some form of wastage. It's the way combustion reactions generally work. Hydrogen engines have to be outfitted very, very specially. When you're converting a diesel engine, or not, I wouldn't say diesel engine, they're a bit different, but a gasoline engine, right? Most fossil fuel engines to run, they can run 40%, 50%, even some of them with slight modification, 100% ethanol, right? Problem with hydrogen is that you can't just pump hydrogen into a car and it work. You have to completely refit your car. It's kind of similar to running LPG gas into your car system, right? It completely remodification, gas seals, etc. It complicates the process extremely amount. Not to mention, hydrogen is extremely explosive. It is infinitely more volatile than gasoline. And if a car goes into a crash, you have essentially a bomb. With gasoline, sure, maybe car explodes, sets on fire a little bit. With hydrogen, the gas, if it leaks and mixes with enough air and in an enclosed space, it will detonate. That is a massive safety issue. And it's generally unfeasible because, in Australia, we don't have the electricity to do it. And plus, we're already shifting towards electrical vehicles anyways. If you're going to use a lot of electricity, why not just jump straight to the source and just have the electricity run through a wire into your car rather than having to go through the entire process of, getting rid of already your electric vehicles that you're halfway invested into, refitting all your existing vehicles, which is hundreds of millions of dollars, and then starting pumping an explosive gas into them. While wasting a bunch more, bunch of energy along the way. If you're going to still use electricity either way, just use it directly. At the end of the day, it's hydrogen gas is extremely inefficient, in my opinion, unless we're talking very, very limited scenarios. It's only suitable for an area that has ample electricity, has low access to fossil fuels, or, if or where we need slightly more power than an electric vehicle, which is at the end of the day still going to be fulfilled by diesel vehicles, because diesel vehicles do provide extremely high load capacity, whereas doesn't matter how powerful a hydrogen engine it is, it simply cannot compare. It's like a gasoline engine versus a diesel engine. Diesel may be limited a bit more in speed, be harder to start up, but it is a more powerful supply, because the gasoline, hydrogen, LPG relies on a spark to ignite. And that is a combustion reaction. Diesel mostly relies on, heated compression and a spontaneous detonation reaction, which is slightly different. The diesel fumes mixed with air, gets compressed to critical mass with an amount of heat, automatically lights itself on fire and explodes. It's more of an explosive push than a gasoline engine, which is more like a really, really quick burn. So all things considered, because the main thing in Australia is obviously suburban and then, truckies to transport stuff. So the truckies definitely won't be happy. You're not taking their diesel engines away anytime soon, and the government won't be. We already have enough electric cars and we're going that direction. And also, why waste the electricity? Why waste more? So I think hydrogen is kind of counterproductive. I doubt we'll ever have it in Australia.
Yeah, Araf,
Are
and to answer, yeah, Araf, yeah. So to answer your question regarding hydrogen, like I agree with Danielson here, but I would also say like hydrogen may have the potential to play like a pivotal role in the global landscape, but Australia, like theoretically speaking, or like Australia has the potential to become a global leader in hydrogen because it has a vast renewable energy sources, and the country is rich in solar and wind energy, which is essential for producing the green hydrogen, which is made by using renewable energy to split water into hydrogen and oxygen via electrolysis. And hydrogen has also the versatility to be used in power generation, transportation, industrial processes, and also like even as an export commodity, which in theory makes it really attractive energy source. And also, like according to the global like the hydrogen market is expected to be $1 trillion market by around 2050 and 2100, and Australia is well placed to capture a significant share of this burgeoning industry, because Australia has a legislative target to reach their net zero carbon emissions. But once again, there's various complications to hydrogen, because first of all there's the political context we have to consider, because yeah, like in terms of speaking for Australia, the majority of the energy is like is it's not renewable. It's mainly coal. So like the transition would be definitely very hectic, and like there's also like the political ambitions of parties. So if they switch to hydrogen, like it won't be suited for them, because then they will lose most of their funders. And also we have to consider some of the economic challenges, because producing hydrogen through electrolysis is way more expensive than just using the fossil fuel. And also like it's also not environmentally friendly, because you're also using more of the fossil fuel to produce it. And like the international like energy agency where estimates that the green hydrogen cost around $3 to like $8 per kilogram to produce, whereas the price of hydrogen produced from natural gas is around $1 to $2 per kilograms. And because of this high cost of production, hydrogen is very unlikely to play a major role to play a major role in the Australian economy and subsequently the world economy. And like as Daniel was saying, like it's highly flammable, and it's also very difficult to store. And also it's also like we have to consider that you need to create a whole infrastructure for hydrogen to produce it. And also like the composition of hydrogen, it's like a very high energy, it has a high energy density, right? So if you the high energy density, because of this there's not lots of complications to it. And because of this, the oil or like coal and like the non-renewable energy sources seem way better. So at this point, like hydrogen, I would say is not feasible. It's not pragmatic for Australia. But I would say for Australia, definitely solar, definitely electric solar power panels, and like definitely electrical ones would also be more feasible. But once again, there's a cost related to it. Those ones, the non-renewable ones, are way cheaper than the renewable energy sources, and that's why people like them. And that's why I think it's very hard, unless you cut the cost of production for these renewable gases, for these renewable energy sources. I don't think it's feasible at all.
Yeah, and to add my opinion, I'd say that one of the primary challenges for expanding hydro in Australia is water availability, as Australia is prone to droughts, and climate change could exacerbate this by making water resources more unpredictable. And hydropower requires constant water flow, and fluctuations in rainfall could impact its reliability. And also, large-scale hydro projects can have significant environmental impacts, including altering river ecosystems, affecting biodiversity, and displacing communities. And there's also resistance to new dam construction, especially from environmental groups and indigenous communities. Also, there's also the factor of cost and time to develop, as building new hydroelectric dams or pumped hydro storage facilities requires significant upfront investment and can take years to complete. And although hydro is cost effective over the long term, The initial capital investment and extended development timelines make it a slower solution compared to solar and wind projects, let's say, which can be deployed more rapidly. Also, and finally, I'd say that while Australia has some geographic areas that are suitable for hydro projects, the potential for large-scale hydropower is limited compared to countries with abundant fresh water sources and mountain terrain. As a result, hydro is unlikely to become the dominant energy source, but it can play a critical supporting role, I'd say.
Fully agree.
Thank you, Daniel, Shazib, and Arif Mali for sharing all the opinions. And to bring our discussion to an end today, I think that Australia's coal conundrum represents a critical crossroads between preserving national economic interests and meeting global climate objections. And while Australia again remains a cornerstone, while coal remains a cornerstone of the Australian economy, supporting exports, regional jobs, and government revenues, the mounting pressure from international climate agreements and shifting global energy markets presents a growing challenge, and the country's future hinges on its ability to manage a transition away from coal, balance the needs of coal-dependent regions with the urgent call to reduce emissions and investments in sustainable and renewable energy. Australia's response will not only shape its domestic economic trajectory, but also its standing in the global fight against climate change and its relationship with other very key important countries in the world, such as China, India, and other such nations. So that's my belief, and that's my conclusion that I think we can all draw based on our discussion today. Is that a conclusion that Daniel, Arif, and Shazib that you would agree with?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
our analysis is spot on.
Yeah, I would agree.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Arif. Thank you, Shazib. So I believe that brings us to the end of our discussion today. And today's discussion was episode 23, Australia's Coal Conundrum, National Interest versus Global Pressure, with Danielson, who is a junior at Knox Grammar School in Sydney. And Danielson, thank you very much for coming and talking to us on our podcast today. Are there any final words that you would like to say before we leave for today?
Absolutely, Arif. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much, and I look forward to working with you guys in the future.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you so much for coming into this podcast. Again, today's podcast was episode 23, Australia's Coal Conundrum, National Interest versus Global Pressure. And I would also like to thank the audience for listening to our podcast and our discussion today. And we hope to see you next week with another very interesting topic, with another very interesting guest speaker. Thank you, and goodbye for now.